Can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Cool. All right. So thank you everybody for coming. I asked to do something a little bit different than I was doing before, just because there's, I think, a need for it. And we have some really, really important things going on the child abuse, neglect, foster care end of things as a result of the coronavirus. And I wanted to have an opportunity to bring that to you. So I want to talk today about a little bit about abuse, neglect, and how to recognize that in virtual education settings, just some best practices. And let me start off by saying that there is not a lot of research or literature in this space. It's a brand new area that hasn't really had any need to look into up until now. We've had some discussions about domestic violence recognition over Zoom, but really nothing in the educational space related to child abuse and neglect. So I think it's timely given what we have gone through and are going into. With that, let me make sure, there we go. I want to issue this warning. When I'm usually pretty light on what I talk about, and I try to keep everything as upbeat as I can. This is not one of those topics. So if this is, I encourage you to stay, but I do use real imagery and real language because this is an important topic that I don't think is fair to sugarcoat. So if this type of thing bothers you, please feel free to not continue to stay here. I don't want anybody upset, but at the same time, again, I encourage you to do so, but I want to be upfront about what this type of presentation is. So the first real question that I have, and if there's only a few people in here, so this should work. If you would, in the chat, has anybody ever reported abuse or neglect in their classroom or out in public? And has gone through this process, so you've seen what this is like. Okay, a decent number. That's good. That's good. It's a difficult thing to do to make these phone calls, even if you're 100% sure. But I want to talk today about recognizing abuse that is in a different setting than we see typically. So the first question is, what does an abused and neglected student look like? And a lot of times this is a really obvious question. It's a really obvious answer to figure out what these kids, we see abuse. And then when you see it, you know it. When you see neglect, you know it. But we see abuse and neglect in person a little bit differently than we see it when we're a bit removed from it. So I hope none of you have seen this. I have been unfortunate enough to have seen a lot of the cases I'm about to show you, but these are pretty common types of abuse. This is burned with a clothes iron. We see this a lot. It's a really obvious, evident injury because you see the steam holes from it. We see things like this. And a lot of times, and we have to take into account that children of this age are at about the right height to run into a doorknob. And we do have that happen. And it's important for us to recognize the other symptoms of that, because while I can tell you that this injury was not created by a doorknob, these are actual crime scene photos or follow-up photos for evidence. And there are certain telltale signs that this was not a single hit. But it does happen. We get kids that were playing football in the backyard and broke their arm, even ones that look like spiral fractures and are spiral fractures, which is a telltale sign of abuse. We have detached retinas from shaken baby syndrome, even though the baby was never shaken. We do have those cases, and it's important for us to know what our responsibility is as far as figuring that out. This is another incredibly common injury, dipping hands in scalding water. This is usually for kids that touch themselves inappropriately. This is a typical abusive punishment for that. Injuries like this, these are the obvious stuff that we see. This, depending on the state, is not actually illegal. In North Carolina, this is not illegal. Where I was working as a teacher, we were told, do not report this. Unless you've broken bones, you can hit your kid with a 2x4, and that's coming directly from Child Protective Services in the state. Most states, this is abusive. You have to make that determination, but you're not going to see this in a virtual environment. Again, whether this is abusive or not can be questionable depending on the state, but I can't imagine a scenario in a virtual environment where you are ever going to see this type of injury. And of course, the worst case scenario. What you might see is neglect. You likely won't, especially not to this extreme, but I have seen this. I have seen this type of place firsthand. I have seen worse than this firsthand, and I'm sure some of you have as well. These are real images. These are what people really live in, what our students really live in sometimes. So what does an abused and neglected student look like? And sometimes this is me. I was cute once. And this is what we see a lot of the times, is we don't see bruises and burns and marks and living in abject squalor. We see a normal, seemingly happy child. And that's not the case. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about what abuse and neglect looks like, and how we can notice it and how we can see it. Because if these were the only images you saw, you don't know the underlying story. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes here. But I can assure you, because I lived it, because it's me, this was an abused child in school that was never noticed. So these are actually removal statistics, why we remove kids from homes. And the majority of the cases are neglect. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, neglect inside that little bucket includes parental drug use. So we remove a disproportionate amount of children because their parents were, they tested positive for drugs, whether or not it actually affects the care of the child. And then you see abuse is about 20% nationally is what we see. And the reason we don't remove for abuse a lot of the times is because abuse is actually, of all of these, is one that's relatively easy to fix without removal. We can monitor it better. We can tell what's going on. We can educate the parents. Neglect is a lot harder, especially when drugs are involved. So we tend to remove kids more for neglect. And keep in mind that these statistics are also incredibly skewed towards lower income and minority parents and children. We tend to remove more poor kids, and we tend to remove more Black and Hispanic children. That is not a statistic because they are abused or neglected more. It is just the nature of what the system looks like right now. And as part of the reforms that we're working towards. But this is the reality of the situation. So when you look at this is what's reported, what we're able to actually do as a system. We see neglect the most as far from a removal standpoint. So part of the problem has been teachers are our biggest reporting vector for child abuse and neglect. So we always have a decrease in abuse and neglect referrals during the summer. That's just a normal course of it. They go up as the school year progresses. And the problem now is that we have lost our largest reporting vector as early as March of 2020. And so we're not catching the cases that we normally would. And in fact, they're significant. This was from the New York Times, that child abuse cases have dropped 51%, and we're worried, and we are. And it's because, as the subheadline is, the coronavirus has shattered the system that protects children, leaving some confined to troubled homes for lingering in foster care. And this is an accurate statistic, but a bad headline. And the reason it's a bad headline is because child abuse cases have not decreased. They have increased. Child abuse reporting and that's what they're calling cases, has decreased by half. And the cases that we're getting are much more severe in terms of their injuries, in terms of outcomes. We are seeing incredibly severe cases come to hospitals where we didn't see them before. In fact, in Dallas, and this was back, I think this headline was from April, I think is when I first was made aware of this particular problem. Cook Hospital, or Children's Hospital in Dallas, they had 2 deaths in the same day, where they usually have 6 in a year. And if you actually extrapolate this data, they had met their yearly total number within a week of this headline. And the problem is multifaceted. It's not just that we just aren't aware of it now. Abuse cases are increasing. The stress of employment. We always have higher levels of abuse during recessions. The problem now is that you have parents and children in much closer proximity than we had before. And what we're seeing is parents that normally did not abuse their children have crossed that line into abuse. And some of that is related to the amount of time that's spent together. Some of it is parents are doing things that they never had to do, forcing their kids to do homework and study and work on school stuff that they didn't have to do before. Like imagine a summertime where the kids are given a lot more flexibility and free reign, and now we're trying to discipline them into a setting that they're not accustomed to. So we're seeing a lot more of those types of cases come through. But again, the cases that we're seeing are the severe cases that are noticeable by the general public, that require medical attention. They're not the ones that we normally see coming from teachers, and it's a really important vector that we're missing. So my hope is that going into the fall, we can raise awareness of some of these things to look out for, to at least increase the number of reports that we're getting for less severe cases of abuse before they become hospitalizations. And the first thing we have to really discuss is, what does abuse in Texas look like? And I'm amazed and I'm not amazed at what people know and don't know about abuse from an educational standpoint. It's always been an area that's very, very personal to me. So this has always been an area I've been just hyper aware of, but recognizing that not everybody knows what abuse looks like, even within the educational system, even within CPS and advocacy agencies. When I talk about mandated reporting, don't always understand what this actually looks like. So the first is physical abuse. This is the one that everybody goes to immediately when we talk about abuse. We're talking about physical harm to a child, and this is from this is Texas law, and I'm quoting it here, that it's a deliberate action resulting in injuries to a child or genuine threats of such actions. So terroristic threats to a child also count as abuse, or concerns about physical injury of an unexplained or suspicious nature. And that's a really important distinction as far as unexplained and what is an injury. So spanking a child is legal in all 50 states. That is injurious. So it does injure the child by definition. It's when does that rise to a level of abusive? And that's where how do you define what an injury is? What is the level of injury that you are saying is a little bit suspicious? And keep in mind, this is how you view suspicion. The other side, we have sexual abuse, which is indecency, assault, aggravated sexual assault, failing to make reasonable effort to prevent sexual conduct in a child, or using that child in obscene or pornographic material. And this, unfortunately, we have seen an increase of, especially with online trafficking and online child pornography. We have seen a huge increase in this as a result of the coronavirus quarantine. So this is the one area I can tell you there is some literature on. Emotional abuse, this is a really, really difficult one to demonstrate and B, prove. But we're talking about an injury by the parent or caregiver that results in an observable effect on the child. These are one of those things that you're going to see. And usually emotional abuse and physical abuse, or emotional abuse and any type of abuse, go hand in hand. You usually see emotional abuse because that's what the parents are using to keep it secret. The physical abuse is one aspect. The emotional abuse is how they can keep this from getting out into the public. So we look at a child's psychological state, and we look at concerns about their mental stability as demonstrated by mood, behavior, and thought. And then we look at trafficking. And again, this is where we've seen an uptick, unfortunately, where we see labor trafficking, where they're used to do work, and this is basically slave labor, and then sex trafficking. And I don't have to get into those definitions here, but these are the Texas definitions. Neglect in Texas is defined as improper supervision of a child left alone, which could have resulted in substantial harm. We just had a case, I think it was yesterday here in Lubbock, of this, where a parent left their, or at least they were arrested yesterday. They left their kid last week in the car for a minimum of a half an hour while they were shopping with the windows rolled up, and the car turned off. And I don't have to tell you what the temperatures looked like last week here. We were in triple digits. This was all, caught on video. I would have broken the car window myself, but I would do that for a dog. But in this case, they called the police, and they, the woman admitted that she left the kids in the car just for a short time, she said, and was arrested for neglect, and the kids were removed. Medical neglect. This is also an area where we're seeing a bit of an increase, but it's difficult to tell, which is failure to seek or obtain or administer medical treatment that could result in harm. So we're seeing parents not taking their kids to the doctor when they need to go. Again, you don't see these very frequently, but they do happen, and I've been involved in a couple of cases that they've been a part of. And then physical neglect, and that's not providing the child with necessary food, clothing, and shelter to maintain a healthy life. And this is where it gets a little bit muddy. So we have a lot of students, I know you all do, that they're hungry. They don't have the necessary food at home. And the question is that physical neglect? And by law, it is. But if we started removing every kid who doesn't have enough to eat at home, we would be in a completely different situation from a crisis standpoint than we are. So this is where your judgment and your looking at the kid is really, really important, and deciding, are they neglected or are they just hungry? Because there is a difference. Physical neglect from a hunger standpoint, they are starving is the barrier here, not just hungry. Abandonment and refusal to accept responsibility, where the parent or caregiver left the kid in a potentially harmful situation and did not return. We're not going to see this too much, but you are the front line in noticing this. Normally, this is where a kid gets left at school and the parents just never come to pick them up, which I hope you've never seen. It's awful, but it's happened. Here, this is, again, where we can recognize it in a virtual environment that their parents haven't been around. And we do see these cases where the parents are gone and the children are home basically to care for themselves for whatever reason. This is one of those areas that we can notice now. And again, refusal to accept responsibility is the kid's been out of the home and they just refuse to allow the kid to return there. Again, you're probably not going to see that in a virtual environment. But this is where it's really important, because this is where we get into what is our obligation as professionals and citizens in the state. So in Texas, anyone, and Texas has one of the most robust mandated reporting laws in the country, anyone who suspects that a child is being abused or neglected has a legal obligation to report it. You can be charged for not reporting it. Professional reporters, which all of you are part of, are required to report suspicion of abuse or neglect within 48 hours. And the reason that particular time frame exists is to give us an opportunity to communicate with other professionals. So for me, for example, in a lot of the work that I do, This would be me contacting CPS caseworkers directly, contacting foster parents directly, working with them to try to figure out what's in the best interest of the child. But in the end, even me talking to CPS and having a conversation with a caseworker, that does not constitute reporting. I still have to call the hotline and have on many occasions. So we have that grace as professionals only to consult other professionals, not just to wait. So how they define professional is anyone licensed or certified by the state or works for an agency or facility licensed and certified by the state that has contact with children as part of their normal duties. And here's the catch. You cannot delegate your duty to report to another person. I actually got in trouble in the state of North Carolina as a teacher for reporting abuse because I was supposed to go to my principal, who then would determine it. I'm still going to continue to report directly. But in that case, I was supposed to tell my principal, who was supposed to make the report. And I was actually reprimanded for calling directly. That is not the case here in Texas. You cannot offload that to a supervisor. It has to go through you. So again, professionals are, and this is a kind of static slide for me. So teachers, nurses, doctors, daycare, healthcare facility workers, probation, correctional officers, and I fall into that under a couple of different hats, as do many of you. So we do have an obligation to report suspicion. And that's the key here. If we suspect it, we have an obligation to report it. So a couple of things to look for, and especially given that this is a virtual environment now, we're not going to see heavy signs of physical abuse or neglect. So looking for sudden changes in behavior or school performance. This is a key indicator, and it goes back to when I showed about emotional abuse. This is one of those things that you're going to see. You're going to see that change in their behavior, in their mood. There's something different about that kid. That should put up a red flag. They're not receiving help for physical or medical problems that have been brought to the parent's attention. And again, this is something that in a conversation with a student, we can notice. If we're just doing, if you were in my earlier presentation or will be in the later one, if you're just doing the Brady Bunch type of instruction, you're not going to notice this because you're just seeing a wall of students. So this is where I advocate a little bit more personal attention with your kids. You will see difference in learning, difficulty concentrating that can't be attributed to something different. So obviously if the kid's just tired, you'll see them lagging a little bit. But if you're seeing that over a prolonged period of time or a drastic change that you cannot just immediately go, oh yeah, that makes sense as to why they're causing it, you want to be suspicious. You want to look for also for kids that are always watchful, kind of paranoid. And I can tell you this is one of the worst and longest lasting side effects of abuse is that paranoia that something's going to happen. And I remember living with this for a very, very long time. And it is something that you can physically see in that interaction with a kid one-on-one, and is something that you can kind of tease out in those conversations. Lacking adult supervision. Again, in a normal school setting, we wouldn't necessarily be able to get that information, but certainly we can get that information now if we're seeing those children virtually. You can tell that the telltale signs that there's no parent in the house. The kids aren't bathing. The kids aren't. They've worn the same clothes for 3-4 days in the video, which I know seems to be the norm. Everybody, it's like, well, I might shower today because I'm not leaving the house. And kids are notorious for that. But you can tell when a kid is starting to decline from a hygiene standpoint, even though you can no longer smell them. And I taught middle school, and that's not a good gauge of whether they're abused or not, because they tend to smell. You see them become, and this year, remember, we're looking for changes, overly compliant, passive, or withdrawn. And that's, it's not, some kids are overly compliant, some kids are overly passive, and it's looking for those changes. And then again, we don't see this normally, or we see this normally, but not in these situations, but coming to school or other activities early, staying late, and they do not want to go home. Kids generally, especially when it comes to school, do not want to be there. They want to be somewhere else. And when you see them wanting to maintain that relationship, to be in that environment, even in an online setting, they want to meet a lot more frequently. There may be something going on. So the solution to this, and it's not easy, but the key to this is 5 words. And I can't say that enough. Get to know them, especially if you're going into a new environment. And one of our biggest fears, and one of mine personally, is you knew your kids in the spring. You may not know them in the fall. So if you're a 6th grade teacher, say, you might not have ever seen these kids or their families, or these may be completely new. And how do we, in an environment where I have never seen what their static environment is, what their normal demeanor is, and all of a sudden I got these kids, how do I recognize these things that are going on? And all I can say is get to know them. And that's why I'm pushing this, or part of the reason I'm pushing this blended framework, where we're having student conferencing with kids, is we're actually getting to know them. We're having these conversations and seeing things in real time, and we're finding out information. So a few steps to take to do this is meet with students weekly, one-on-one if possible. Very small groups if absolutely necessary, but meet with them regularly. Don't just have these conversations with an entire class. Don't do something like I'm doing right now, where I'm talking to 15, 16 people and just spewing information out, but actually speak with them one-on-one, get to know them, get to know what their problems are. Insist on video chats, only if one-on-one. And if you were in my other session, or come to the next one in 40 minutes or so, I will tell you, don't have them turn on video in large events, for the same reason I said, when you have that background and you can see the neglect, so can all the other students, and they don't need to see that in a whole class environment. But if you see this one-on-one, you can see what's going on. You can see abuse, you can see reactions, you can see backgrounds, you can see what's going on, and you can learn a lot. Again, I don't know if you can see my background here, but before I shared my screen, you can learn a lot from me just looking at the environment in which I'm sitting. So I'm in my what is now my office at home, but it's normally my little music room. So you've got guitars behind me, keyboards, drums. My dog was chewing on a bone and running around a little bit ago. Like, you can learn a lot about me just by looking at the environment that's behind me. Some people have a very particular environment for a reason, but you can get to know this. Insist on having video. Ask about how things are going at home. Don't just focus on academics. Listen to, hi, how's everything doing? What are you doing for fun? Are you getting outside? Are you, just big generic questions, just that, get to know them, know what they're doing. Are they playing video games? What video games? This will help for a lot of reasons. To build that relationship with them and get to know them, but also it will give you clues as to what's happening behind the scenes that you can't see. Communicate with the parents if you can. And I know this is difficult under normal circumstances, but see if you can get the parents in on the video once in a while, not every week, but maybe once a month, or have a specific communication with a parent. See how things are going. How can you help? And that will do a couple of things. One, it will help you recognize if issues are happening, but it also may give you, or give the parent, an outlet to say, hey, look, I'm struggling keeping them focused during the day. What are some strategies I can use? And if you engage the parents and elicit that information, they'll give you a lot more information than before. And rather than just noticing abuse and neglect happening, you might be able to prevent it. And I've had these conversations with parents when I was in the classroom, where I remember specifically, it was a 6th grade kid, and it was a new father. The mother had passed away, and the kid was struggling, 6th grade, it's a rough age. And I remember the father asking me, should I hit him? And I went, no, don't. And we went through the reasons why that wasn't an appropriate form of discipline at that age and for what was going on, that there were other alternatives. And we worked through that, and potentially, and I think in that case, did prevent an abusive situation, because that parent later came in and literally jacked a kid up by his throat that was picking on his son in the hallway and was arrested. So if that was his reaction to strangers, I have no doubt that could have happened in the home. So having those conversations are really, really important with the parents. And I can't stress enough, pay attention to small details. Pay attention to, obviously, whether the kid's, hair is combed is not going to be a good indicator. I just finally this morning gave myself another, quarantine haircut, which it was a little bit better the second time around than the first. But, I haven't been exactly, paying attention. My beard was giant until this morning. Those little details you might not see, but if I'm wearing the same shirt every day, you might notice that. If I've got the same dirt spot on my face every day, you might notice that. Again, paying attention to background, things like that are really going to come into play here. Also, screenshot and record meetings if you're suspicious. So especially if you're looking for over a period of time and you're saying, look, this kid has had the same dirt spot on his face. And if you're suspicious, just do a quick screen grab. Every computer can do it, or your phone. It's a pretty easy command. And that way you have it. Or record those meetings. And keep in mind, there's FERPA and everything else. Obviously, don't share that information outside of an investigative event. But you don't have to have permission to record a meeting in the state of Texas. It is a one-party state. So there is no law against recording that session if you're suspicious something might happen later on. Communicate with other teachers. I know that we've been in a bit of a bubble and I miss a lot of my coworkers just going down, having a cup of coffee in their office for a couple of minutes, just to break up the day a little bit. And I know when I was a classroom teacher, I had to get out of my classroom every once in a while and have lunch or have a planning period where I just met with a colleague. But those conversations that occur in those small meetings and informal environments about, hey, I've got this kid and this is what I'm seeing. Are you seeing anything? We're missing that as part of this broader quarantine environment where we're not together and having those more informal conversations. We may have PLCs, but we may only focus on content and not focus on the individual students themselves. So if you're having an issue with a child, talk to other teachers. If other people are recognizing that pattern, that's indicative of some sort of problem. A couple of things not to do, there's a few things that, and they're a little bit counterintuitive given what I just said, but really pay attention to this. And one of them is, do not ask the student direct questions. Okay, and the reason is they may not be safe to answer those questions. And I should really write, do not ask the students questions, but don't ask the students direct questions. If you suspect they're being abused, do not ask them. You don't know who's watching. You don't know who's in the same room, who can overhear that conversation. If you ask them, are they being abused? And then the parents that are doing it know there's something, or there's a suspicion going on there that can endanger the child. Do not talk to the parent if you suspect abuse. Do not have that conversation with them. Again, for the exact same reason. And keep this in mind. You are not an investigator. You don't want to be. Trust me. I performed in that role. It is awful. It is a difficult situation, and you will be called to testify if you are one of the people investigating an abusive case. It is not a good situation to be in if you don't have the power of law enforcement behind you. Do not try to figure out what's going on. What I want you to do is collect information, collect those screenshots, put down your notes of what you see is going on, because the more information you have, the more the investigators can use to go after and to investigate the abuse. And report any suspicion. That's what the law entails. It's a suspicion. not you do not have to be able to prove that abuse is happening. The law just says that you suspect that it's happening. If there are issues, this is the phone number and the website to go to. For some of you, you've made these calls before. I highly recommend you make the phone call rather than the online form. I've done both. The online form requires you to log in, to register, which isn't a problem. But you don't get all the questions that you'll get when you talk to the intake investigator on the phone. And they're very, very good at what they do. And what I can tell you is that, contrary to a lot of opinion, I can tell you for a fact the state of Texas takes confidentiality very, very seriously. My own personal experience with this was I had a parent in court that tried to use the fact that I reported them against me to try and address my credibility and say that I was biased because I made this report. And the judges were exceptionally clear that the fact that I had made that report was not admissible as evidence. It could not be brought up in any way, shape, or form, even though I had written down in a court report that I was the one who made the report. That was still kept confidential, even though I had publicly stated that I did it. It's taken very, very seriously in the state of Texas. So don't feel that that you have to that you're going to be outed. It is a very secure system. And finally, it's a dark conversation to have. But these are I guess I want to call them my success cases, but unfortunately one of them is no longer. But these are students that I've worked through abuse and severe abuse cases. And this is Damien, Ben and his family, and Trent, and they're all doing absolutely amazing, except for Damien, who's now unfortunately in prison. But we were able to get them out of some really horrific situations because people noticed what was going on. And I can tell you, as somebody who, even though I reported myself that I was being abused, it didn't go anywhere. That the investigation was unfounded because I recanted because they interviewed me in front of my parents. That there are success cases, and we can get these kids out of these situations by paying attention, no matter how dark it is. And I can tell you that 2 of the 3 here are incredibly successful because we got them in better situations. And the other one, unfortunately, like I said, was successful for a long time, but we lost him. But this is the role we play, and in doing this kind of presentation, I hope that you'll just keep your eye out and remember that just because we're not in front of anymore doesn't mean we can't spot these things that we spotted before. And I hope that you do. And if you have any questions as far as that, please reach out to me. I keep all of those conversations 100% confidential as well, and I'm happy to give advice if you're in a spot where you're not quite sure what to do, and I can point you in the right direction. So thank you for coming to this. I do appreciate it because it is an important topic. But if there's any questions, I think we've got a few minutes left.
Yes, we do. We have 7 minutes left in the session, or maybe 6 now. If you all have any questions, you're welcome to, or even comments, you're welcome to unmute your microphones, or you're welcome to type them into the chat as well. And of course, to thank Dr. Kelly as well for this very valuable information.
So Susan wrote, I'm just going to read what's in the chat, just if everybody doesn't have it up. Wrote that she's fearful of students who do not have internet access and are unable to see virtually if anything's going on. And this is unfair to teachers, and I'm going to be completely upfront about that. I highly recommend that, at least for the time being, that you look at alternative meeting times, if you can, with your students, and find when they're available. If you have a case where a student is not able to access the internet and is unable to come to school, you can't reach the parents, that's a case where I encourage you to talk to both administration, call me, and because this is going to be an interesting case of whether that's actionable. and I'm not an advocate for removing children from the home, especially for situations that the parents can't control. If they can't afford the internet, they can't afford the internet. But at the same time, they have an obligation to provide their child with education. And so if there's a case where a child can't get access to the internet and the only educational option is online, we as a system have to find those resources. And if you have that kid, call me. I will find it. I will pay for it myself if I have to, because these kids need that access. If the parents are refusing to get that access, there would be that question of whether that falls under educational neglect and whether that's reportable and actionable, where we can get the system involved to not remove the kid, because we are not going to remove a kid solely for educational neglect. I've never seen it happen, and I would never advocate for it. But can we, through that system, provide resources to them, or force the parents to provide those resources if necessary? So yes, and no, and all districts, this is what I have said. I will not armchair quarterback what happened in the spring nor in the fall. We're in uncharted territory. But what I will say is the schools did an amazing job of trying to provide as much access as possible. What I'm in a case where the kids can't get access, I'm saying if the parents aren't allowing it for some reason, that's where we need to step in as a system and say, no, the kids are entitled to this, especially if it's hiding an underlying abuse or neglect case. Those are the cases I really encourage you to pay attention to. And again, get to know your kids, and don't just say, well, they didn't show up, I'm not going to deal with that. And I was that way when I taught high school. You didn't want to come to class, go hang out in the cafeteria. I'm not going to track you down and have that fight. But this is a different environment that we need to make sure that the kids at least can access us, and it's not the parents that are stopping that. So, but if you have any issues related to that, I'd be happy to help with whatever resources I can bring to bear. And I know for a fact your district will, because they're doing things like this, which is amazing. And your district rocks, by the way. I really can't wait to get down and see you guys in action when I'm able to travel again.